above, just above idle, up to and including, climb. This is for 2 engines, okay? For 1 engine, it goes up to
MCT.
flex MCT. Right now, I'm up here in toga, which means I'm out of the active range entirely.
Right.
So that's why it says manual and toga, okay? SRS means speed reference system, which really means what? Flight director guidance is gonna go to 15 degrees nose up. Unless an engine fails, it's gonna go to 12.5 degrees.
Hey, we forgot to put a flap.
Did we?
The FMC doesn't have one, and
I probably can't even put it down.
The SRS coincides with your vertical path, whether you're 2-engine or single-engine.
I don't even think we set the flap.
Yeah, we did.
Have it?
Say it again, I'm sorry, Steve? Yeah, what was that?
That's sort of the speed reference system that relates to single-engine or 2-engine flight path or pitch or whatever.
Yeah, it's always gonna say SRS, whether you're single engine or dual engine, it'll always say SRS. And it's gonna be either 15 degrees with 2 engines or 12.5 with 1 engine.
And that's all SRS is?
Pretty much, yeah, that's it. When do you get SRS on takeoff and on go around?
Mhm.
And remember, how do you get into go around? Toga thrust with flaps 1 or greater, right? Okay, so,
12.5.
yeah, 12.5 with 1 engine and 15 with 2 engines. Nice. Climb blue, okay? It's armed right now. So we're initially in 15 degrees nose up, and then we're gonna go into thrust climb, open climb, or a managed climb, but it's armed right now. Nav is armed. We're gonna start navving 35 feet off the runway, okay? It says runway. Why does it say runway? Because the runway we're departing has a localizer frequency. So you'll notice there's a green stick, which we commonly refer to as the Washington Monument, because it very much looks like the Washington Monument. It's a little stick like this. So we just call it that for the heck of it. But the only reason this is here is because runway populated, and this is the localizer indication for you to maintain centerline, okay, tracking. If you're departing a runway that does not have a localizer, you will not see runway, and you will not have this indication here. So your FMA callout would be Manitoga SRS auto thrust blue. Runway is missing. So when would I only see runway? If there's a localizer. That's it. That's it. Okay? If I don't see runway, is something wrong? No. I just don't have a localizer, right? Auto thrust is blue because it's armed. Remember, blue is armed. Why is it armed? Because it's out of the active range. It's in toga, man toga right now. When I come at the thrust reduction altitude, which is where? 1510, see this here, 1510. At 1510, when I reduce the thrust, I'm gonna bring it back to the climb detent. Now I'm back in the active range, and auto thrust is gonna go white. Right? All right, let's keep rolling here. Okay, there's 80. By the way, let me freeze it. Typically you have a half stick input, okay? So it's halfway down. And then when you reach 80 knots, thrust set, this is Spirit specific, right? Then you relax the pressure and you're neutral by 100.
Centerline left.
Right? There's V1, right? Rotate. 3
V1,
degrees per second.
rotate.
Whatever that is, okay.
Positive rate.
You're up. See how nav went in? That was at 35 feet, so now we're nabbing. Okay, I'm just gonna put the autopilot on.
Therefore we die.
Now, let me ask you all a question. What phase are we in right now?
Climb.
Okay? How do you know? Always. There's one button to push, always. Remember yesterday I said, here's 8 phases. You always know what phase you're in when you push this one button. Not the autopilot. The autopilot's on. It's in the McDo right over here.
Probably.
The one next to it.
Perf.
Perf. You hit perf. So now watch, which I'm already there. Perf, read the top. In green it says,
Takeoff.
I'm in the takeoff phase. Right now, I'm in the takeoff phase, right? Now, it's gonna go to the climb phase. Okay? I don't know if you guys took notes on this yesterday, but when does it go to the climb phase?
Okay, let me look at my notes.
Acceleration
Acceleration altitude, right?
Yep, acceleration altitude.
Ah, so what's the acceleration altitude?
15, 18.
Okay, whatever it
15,
says here, 1510, right? Okay, so check this out. Watch. Here comes 15, we're at 1,000. Here comes 1510. Look at this page right here. Look up here.
Switches.
Boom. Climb phase now. You have to know this thing is doing these things because now I know always, okay, what's my speed doing? Now look at what happened to my speed. It jumped to 250.
Right, because that's what that phase was, 250.
Right? So now just based on looking at my climb page, I'm like, okay, this thing's going to 250 now. Or if I look over here and it's commanding 250, I know I'm in the climb phase. So I can start to correlate back and forth what's happening now. Okay, now I should get lever climb, which I do, it's flashing at me. So now I just bring the thrust levers back. Okay, here comes thrust climb. Boom. Well, speed. Now, why did it go to speed? Because we're outstarring right now. Outstar means it's capturing altitude. What's the altitude it's capturing?
3,000.
And we're at 21. So right now you're going to say,
1,000 feet to go.
1,000 to go. We're a little bit inside, but it's 1,000 to go. It used to be 2,000 for 3,000. They
1,000
changed
to go.
it. It's 1,000 to go. Yeah.
So let me ask you, if you were not out capping now, because you were going to 5,000 or something, when you went to climb, what would the speed say,
Thrust climb.
thrust climb?
Yeah. Okay. Now, when before auto thrust was blue, remember?
Mm-hmm.
Now it's white,
Now it's active.
right? Because now it's back here in climb, so it's active right now. Okay. And we're in speed mode. So let's talk about speed mode versus thrust climb for a second. There's two types of thrust modes: variable and fixed. Okay, there's fixed thrust and there's variable thrust. Fixed thrust means what? What it sounds like. The thrust is fixed. Variable thrust means the thrust will vary to maintain speed. Fixed thrust, example, thrust climb, thrust idle. These are fixed thrust settings, right? Variable thrust would be speed, what we're seeing right now. What does speed mean? That means your thrust is going to vary to maintain speed. Now, to make that extremely simple, let's say you're hand flying a 7.3, or an MD-80, or a CRJ, or an Embraer 175, or 777, or whatever. And you're at 5,000, okay, and they say climb and maintain 7,000. How are you going to do this if you're hand flying? You're likely going to advance thrust, pitch up, and then when you're approaching altitude, you start to level off and do what to the thrust?
Bring it back.
And reduce. So your thrust is, every time you level, whether from a climb or from a descent, you're varying the speed. So now this goes into outstar, right? What does outstar mean? Outstar means we are capturing the altitude. When do we outstar? When do we go into outstar? Okay, the answer for when do we outstar is it entirely depends on your rate of climb or descent. So right now we're climbing at 3,300 feet per minute, and 900 feet prior to 3,000, we're at 2,100. 900 feet prior, this thing is going to start to level off. What if I was climbing at a rate of 500 foot per minute? I probably wouldn't be capturing.
Yeah.
Right? So one of the things you want to keep in mind is when do we outstar? Whenever the aircraft determines it is the appropriate time to begin leveling off to maintain, here's the key, a 1G path. Everything in the FMA and everything in the FCU is 1G. If you do thrust idle open descent, it'll descend and capture at 1G. If you input a heading, it's going to do it at 1G. If you capture an altitude and a climb, it's going to do it at 1G. So if I'm climbing this aggressively, 3,300 feet a minute, it's going to level off sooner. And if I'm climbing shallower, it's gonna level off later. And when outstar goes in, you will always get speed mode. Speed mode is variable thrust, because as the aircraft begins to nose over, thrust will begin to vary. Now, go ahead.
And the climb thrust is when it's already there, and it's not gonna change for a while.
Correct.
So you will always go, you probably, let's say if you were doing you have climbing constraints. If you do climbing constraints first at 3,000, then at 10,000, you would always see speed, and then you would see climb thrust, and then speed and climb thrust, as if it's gonna level off, right?
Correct. You see thrust climb, speed out star. Thrust climb, speed out star. Thrust climb, which is basically, think about you hand flying, right? Climb, level off. Climb, level off. It's the same thing. Yeah, it's the same thing. So speed mode, which is variable thrust, we now know is gonna go in every time I have out star. All right?
Because now you're just trying to maintain the speed.
Exactly. It's also gonna go in when I have glide slope star. These are the times when speed mode is gonna go in.
You gotta think of thrust ref.
Okay? It's also gonna go in with vertical speed, it's also gonna go in with FPA, it's also gonna go in with final lap,
Yeah,
and it's also gonna go in with flight directors off.
yeah, because you're
These are all
maintaining,
variable.
you're
These
maintaining
are all
the
variable
speed.
time, variable thrust.
Can you just run that atlas right quick?
Yeah, man.
One time?
So here's what you're gonna want your note to say. These are the times when you are in speed mode, variable thrust. Out star, glide slope star, vertical speed, FPA, final app, flight directors off. And the last one, because there's 7, is geo descent path, geometric descent path. That means we're not on a thrust idle path descending, we're on a path that requires variable thrust. So it'll say speed descent. Normally on top of descent, you want it to say thrust idle descent. And then, remember I said earlier, it can only do one thrust idle path. So once it reaches the point where it needs a variable thrust setting, it's gonna go into speed descent. So you would expect to see speed on a geometric descent path as well. Now, think about your TCAS memory item. TCAS, I have control. Anytime you hear traffic, you're gonna say TCAS, I have control. And then, when it says climb, what are you gonna do? Autopilot off, flight directors off.
Mhm.
Okay, autopilot off, flight directors off. Who does flight directors off? Pilot monitoring does flight directors off. You don't want to each of you turn off your own flight director. You don't want to do that, because what happens is, let me back up. The reason you're doing flight directors off is because that's one of the things that will trigger speed mode. Speed mode means what? If I pull up, there is a thrust increase. If I push down, there is a thrust decrease. Because let's say you're maintaining 250 knots. In speed mode, my thrust will vary to maintain my speed, right? So if I pull up and I start bleeding speed, I have my thrust there to protect me and give me power. And likewise, if I nose down and I start increasing speed, the thrust will spool back to idle and it will protect me. So let's go back to the TCAS RA, right? The reason you're turning both flight directors off is to get speed protection in speed mode. Well, if you each turn off your flight director, captain turns off his, and you turn off yours, but you fail to actually turn it off. Let's say you hit the button, but you don't actually turn it off. So now your FMA, column 5, says 1 FP dash instead of nothing. You never get speed mode. It could stay in thrust idle or thrust climb if it says dash FP2 or 1 FP dash. So you want one person, pilot monitoring, to turn off both flight directors, check column 5 to make sure that they actually both turned off, so that the other guy flying has speed protection when they're doing their RA maneuver. Make sense?
If you were level flight when this happened, what mode would you have there?
Speed.
Speed.
Speed, in level flight, you would have speed. And then you-
However, even if you might think, well, if I have speed mode and I'm in level flight, and I don't turn off the flight directors, I'm fine, right? As far as the speed mode is concerned, you're fine. However, now you're reacting to an RA with conflicting flight director guidance. So you want the flight directors out of view, because you're not gonna be following them, and if you're not following them, turn them off, right? That's what Boeing says too, if you're not gonna follow them, turn them off. So, I knew we wouldn't get far before I start expanding on this, but does that make sense so far? Okay. Okay.
You know, Carlos, the way I associate it is the speed mode will be like the flight level change,
Flight speed.
So it'll change.
and the
Yeah,
other,
man.
the other
Tell me.
mode is thrust rest and lean out, right? It goes max down,